There was a time when pain had no name, no language to describe it, no science to explain it. Only a sudden, sharp sensation rising from the depths of the human body, reaching the mind like a silent scream. Somewhere in prehistory, long before cities, before writing, before medicine, a human touched their jaw and froze. Something was wrong. Something inside their mouth was attacking them, and they had no idea why. That moment may have been the first toothache in human history. Not just pain, but confusion, fear, and the beginning of a question humanity would chase for thousands of years. Toothache is one of the most universal human experiences. Today, we understand it, we treat it, we prevent it. But for most of human history, it was something far more terrifying, an invisible force, striking without warning, impossible to escape. Archaeological discoveries reveal something astonishing. Humans were suffering from tooth decay over 10,000 years ago. Even hunter-gatherers, living in what we imagine as a natural and healthy world, were not free from this pain. But here is the real mystery. They didn't know what a tooth was. They didn't understand infection, bacteria, or decay. So when pain struck, they searched for meaning, not medicine. And what they found would shape myths, rituals, and early forms of treatment across entire civilizations. This is not just the story of a toothache. This is the story of how humans first encountered pain inside their own bodies, and how that pain slowly led to one of the most important medical revolutions in history. There was a time when pain had no name, no word to contain it, no story to explain it, no healer to ease it. Only sensation raw, immediate, and deeply personal. In the silence of a prehistoric night, beneath the flicker of a dying fire, a human being presses their hand against their jaw, and something feels terribly wrong. A pulse, a pressure, a pain that does not come from the outside world, but from within. This is not the pain of a wound, not the pain of a predator's bite. This is different. There is no blood, no visible injury, no enemy to fight, and yet the pain grows. It throbs with a rhythm that feels alive. It spreads into the skull, into the ear, into the mind. The human body, once a tool for survival, has become a source of suffering. And for the first time, a terrifying realization begins to form. What if the danger is not out there, but inside me? What we now call a toothache may have first appeared tens of thousands of years ago, long before cities, long before language, long before medicine. Scientific evidence suggests that even prehistoric humans, living as hunter-gatherers, experienced dental decay. In fact, some of the oldest known cases of tooth damage date back nearly 14,000 years. This means something profound. Pain inside the mouth is not a modern problem. It is ancient, deeply rooted in the human condition. But here's where the mystery deepens. These early humans had no concept of teeth as we understand them today. They did not know about enamel, nerves, or bacteria. They could not see the microscopic processes destroying them from within. So when the pain struck, they were left with only one tool: imagination. And imagination, when combined with fear, can create explanations far more terrifying than reality. So imagine that moment again. The fire is fading. The pain is growing. Sleep is impossible. The mind begins searching for answers in the darkness. Is something crawling inside the tooth? Is it a curse? A punishment? A living force hidden beneath the surface? The first toothache was not just a physical sensation. It was the beginning of a psychological battle between the human mind and the unknown. And that battle would shape myths, beliefs, and early medicine for thousands of years to come. And yet, one question remains, one that echoes across time, unanswered in that moment of darkness. If they didn't know what teeth were, how did they explain the pain? For tens of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving with the land, eating what nature provided, their bodies shaped by scarcity and survival. Their diet was harsh but balanced: meat, wild plants, fibrous roots, and surprisingly, their teeth endured. Not perfectly, but better than we might expect. Pain existed, but it was sporadic, unpredictable, rare, almost like a whisper in the vast timeline of human life. Then something shifted. Around 10,000 years ago, humanity made a decision that would alter its destiny forever. They stopped moving. They began to settle. Fields replaced forests. Seeds replaced instincts. This was the birth of agriculture, and with it, the birth of a new kind of suffering. Wheat, barley, and early forms of cultivated grains became the foundation of human survival. Food became more reliable, but also more dangerous in ways no one could see. Because these new foods carried something invisible, something powerful: carbohydrates. Broken down into sugars, they fed not just humans, but something else living inside them. Bacteria silent, microscopic, ancient. These organisms began to thrive in ways they never had before, producing acids that slowly, relentlessly dissolved the human tooth from within. What had once been rare became common. What had once been a whisper of pain became a chorus. Archaeological evidence tells a striking story. When scientists examine the teeth of hunter-gatherers, they find relatively low levels of decay. But in early farming communities, something changes dramatically. Cavities appear more frequently. Teeth wear down faster. Infections spread. Entire populations begin to suffer from dental disease at a scale never seen before. This was not just an individual experience anymore. It was the beginning of humanity's first widespread dental crisis. And yet, from their perspective, this made no sense. Agriculture brought stability. It reduced hunger. It allowed civilizations to grow. So why did it also bring this deep, relentless pain? Why did something as essential as food begin to feel like a hidden threat? For the first time, humans were not just surviving the world around them. They were being slowly damaged by the very thing keeping them alive. Food gave them life, but it also brought them pain. And in that contradiction, something fundamental changed in the human mind. Pain was no longer random. It was no longer isolated. It was repeating, patterned, growing. And so, a new kind of question emerged, not how to escape pain, but why it existed at all. So humans began searching for a reason, not a cure. As pain became more common, the human mind refused to accept it as random. Patterns demanded explanations. And in the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where some of the earliest civilizations began to write, a strange and powerful idea took shape. It was not invisible forces, not decay, not disease. It was something alive, something hidden, something inside the tooth itself. They called it the tooth worm, a tiny creature burrowing into the tooth, feeding on it, twisting and turning as it caused unbearable pain. In a world without microscopes, without biology, this explanation felt real, almost logical. Pain pulsed, moved, throbbed, just like a living thing. And so, the invisible was given a form. The unknown was given a face. Ancient texts etched into clay tablets thousands of years ago describe rituals meant to drive this creature out. Incantations, herbal mixtures, even early surgical attempts, all aimed at one goal: to remove the living cause of suffering. The belief spread across cultures, evolving but never disappearing. From Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt, from India to China, the idea of something alive inside the tooth endured for millennia. But what makes this belief so powerful is not its inaccuracy, it is its emotional truth. Because for those who suffered, the pain did feel alive. It moved, it returned. It could wake a person in the middle of the night and refuse to let go. Without science, the only way to understand such pain was to imagine it as an enemy. And nothing is more terrifying than an enemy you cannot see, but can always feel. Imagine lying in the darkness, your jaw burning, your mind racing. You cannot see the cause. You cannot stop it. And the only explanation you have is that something is inside you, feeding on you. In that moment, belief becomes reality. Fear becomes certainty. And the human mind, desperate for control, holds on to the only answer it has. They believed something was alive inside their pain. And for thousands of years, that belief guided how humans responded not with understanding, but with ritual, with desperation, with hope that the creature could somehow be forced out. Belief alone could not silence the pain. Rituals failed, prayers faded, and slowly, across different corners of the ancient world, a new idea began to emerge. If something inside the body was causing suffering, perhaps it could be physically removed. In civilizations like ancient Egypt, ancient India, and ancient China, the first attempts at dental intervention took shape, not guided by modern science, but by observation, courage, and desperation. At first, the solutions were brutal. A loose tooth? Pull it out. A painful one? Remove it entirely. Using primitive tools, stone fragments, metal hooks, sharpened instruments, early practitioners began performing extractions. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of infection, only the belief that removing the source might end the suffering. And sometimes it did. But often, the cure brought a new kind of pain, more immediate, more violent, more terrifying than the disease itself. Then came something even more astonishing. In the ancient settlement of Mehrgar, evidence reveals that as early as 9,000 years ago, humans were not just removing teeth, they were drilling into them. Using stone tools, they created small, precise holes in decayed teeth, possibly to relieve pressure or remove infected material. This was not random violence. This was intention. This was the beginning of dental surgery. Imagine the scene. A human being, fully conscious, held still as another carefully presses a spinning stone into their tooth. No numbing, no relief, only trust or perhaps desperation. The sound alone would have been unbearable, the sensation unimaginable, and yet they endured it, because the pain they were trying to escape had already pushed them beyond fear. These early dentists were not healers in the way we understand today. They were pioneers standing at the edge of the unknown, experimenting, risking, learning through trial and error. Some attempts failed, some caused more harm, but others worked. And in those rare moments of relief, something powerful was born. The idea that pain inside the body could be treated. By the time Europe entered the Middle Ages, pain had become a public spectacle. In crowded marketplaces and narrow streets, beneath the noise of daily life, a different kind of performance unfolded, one built on fear, desperation, and endurance. There were no sterile clinics, no trained dentists as we know them today. Instead, there were barbers' men who cut hair, shaved beards, and pulled teeth. These barber surgeons stood at the fragile intersection between survival and suffering. The procedure was simple, brutally simple. A person in agony would sit or be held down, their mouth forced open, their body restrained. Tools often crude, heavy, unforgiving would be placed around the tooth. And then, with force rather than precision, the extraction began. No anesthesia, no numbing. Only raw sensation flooding the body, the crack of the tooth, the tearing of tissue, the immediate, overwhelming shock. And they did this in public. Crowds gathered, watching as pain became a shared experience. Some came out of necessity, others out of curiosity. The screams were unavoidable, echoing through the streets, cutting through conversation, impossible to ignore. In that moment, the boundary between observer and victim blurred, because everyone watching knew, sooner or later, it could be them. Barber surgeons were not cruel by intention. They were products of their time working, without knowledge of bacteria, without understanding of infection, without the tools to truly heal. Speed was their only mercy. The faster the tooth came out, the shorter the suffering. But even then, there were no guarantees. Many survived the extraction, only to face infection, swelling, or a different kind of pain that lingered long after the procedure ended. Imagine standing in that crowd, hearing the first scream, feeling your own jaw ache in sympathy, watching someone endure what you cannot escape. In a world without anesthesia, pain was not just experienced, it was witnessed, shared, remembered. It became part of cultural memory, passed from generation to generation as something to fear, something unavoidable. There was no escape, only endurance. And in that endurance, humanity carried the weight of centuries waiting, without knowing it, for a breakthrough that would finally silence the scream. For centuries, pain had been endured, feared, and misunderstood. But in the quiet revolution of the 17th century, something extraordinary began to change, not in the body, but in the way humans saw the invisible. A Dutch scientist named Antonia van Leeuwenhoek looked through a handmade lens and discovered an entirely new world. Tiny, moving organisms, what he called animalcules, living in places no one had ever imagined, including the human mouth. For the first time in history, the idea of something alive inside the mouth was no longer just a myth, it was observable reality. But this time, it wasn't a worm. It was far smaller, far more numerous, and far more dangerous than anyone had ever believed. These microorganisms thrived on food particles, especially sugars, producing acids that slowly broke down the structure of the tooth. The pain that once felt like a living creature was in fact the result of an invisible biological process. As scientific understanding grew, so did a new perspective on disease itself. Pain was no longer seen as a curse, a punishment, or a mystery hiding in darkness. It became something measurable, observable, explainable. The human body was no longer a battlefield of unknown forces. It was a system that could be studied, understood, and eventually controlled. And with that shift, dentistry began to transform from crude intervention into structured medicine. But this transformation did not happen overnight. Old beliefs lingered. Fear remained. Even as science provided answers, the memory of pain, raw, ancient, deeply human, continued to shape how people responded to it. The scream in the marketplace, the dread of extraction, the myth of something alive inside the tooth. These did not disappear. They evolved, slowly giving way to knowledge, but never fully fading from the human experience. And yet, something fundamental had changed forever. For the first time, humanity was not just reacting to pain. They were understanding it, studying it, learning how to prevent it. The invisible enemy had been revealed, and with that revelation came power. The power to intervene before suffering began. The power to replace fear with control. Pain was no longer a mystery. It was a problem to solve. And in that moment, the long journey from fear to knowledge reached a turning point, one that would redefine not only dentistry, but the entire future of medicine. Today, we live in a world our ancestors could never have imagined. Clean clinics, precision instruments, anesthesia that can silence pain before it even begins. What was once a brutal public ordeal is now a controlled clinical procedure. Modern dentistry has transformed the experience from something to fear into something to manage. And yet, something curious remains. Step into a dental clinic today, and everything is different. The sterile smell, the soft lighting, the calm voice of a trained professional. Local anesthesia numbs the nerves. Advanced tools remove decay with precision. Preventive care brushing, flossing, regular checkups can stop pain before it ever starts. For the first time in human history, we have the power not just to treat toothache, but to prevent it entirely. And yet, despite all of this, people are still afraid. The sound of the drill, the anticipation, the memory sometimes personal, sometimes inherited of pain. Studies show that dental anxiety remains one of the most common fears worldwide. Even in an age of science and comfort, the body reacts as if danger is still present. The heart rate rises, muscles tense. The mind prepares for something it knows may never come. Because fear, like pain, has a history. It is not just learned, it is carried, passed down through generations, shaped by thousands of years of real suffering. The human brain does not easily forget what once threatened survival. And so, even as science removes the pain, the shadow of that pain remains quiet, persistent, waiting beneath the surface. So we return to the question, has fear truly ended? Or has it simply changed form? Perhaps the greatest transformation is not the elimination of pain, but our relationship with it. We no longer see it as a curse or a mystery. We understand it. We anticipate it. We control it. But we still feel it echoing faintly from a time when the human body was an unknown world. The pain that started in darkness shaped modern medicine, and in that journey from fear to knowledge, from suffering to science, we find not just the history of a toothache, but the story of what it means to be human. It began in silence. No words, no warnings, just a sudden pulse of pain in the darkness. A human being, alone with a sensation they could not name, could not see, could not escape. That moment small, invisible in the vast timeline of history, would become one of the most important turning points in the story of our species. Because that pain demanded something more than endurance. It demanded meaning. It pushed the human mind to imagine, to question, to search for answers beyond instinct. From myths of creatures hidden within the tooth, to the first crude attempts to remove the source, to the discovery of an entire microscopic world, each step was driven by the same force, the refusal to accept suffering without understanding it. And in that journey, something remarkable happened. Pain, once a symbol of fear, became a pathway to knowledge. It forced humanity to look inward, to explore the hidden systems of the body, to uncover the rules that govern life itself. What began as a single personal experience slowly transformed into a collective pursuit of science. Today, we stand at the end of that long path, holding answers our ancestors could never have imagined. And yet, every time we feel even the slightest echo of that ancient pain, we are connected to them, to their fear, their questions, their first attempts to understand the unknown. The past is not gone. It lives quietly within us. The first toothache was not just pain. It was the beginning of understanding the human body. And perhaps, in that simple truth, lies something deeper. Every pain we feel is not just a signal of harm, but an invitation to understand who we are. If this journey through the origins of human pain and understanding has sparked something in you, consider subscribing. Not just to follow stories like this, but to stay connected to the deeper layers of human history we continue to uncover together. Leave a like if this story made you reflect on how far we've come from fear to knowledge. And share your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you the most about the first toothache in human history? Your perspective becomes part of this ongoing conversation. And if you're ready for the next chapter of humanity's hidden stories, the next video is already waiting for you. Another journey into the strange, the forgotten, and the untold moments that shaped who we are today. Take care of yourself, protect your health, and remember your body is not just something you live in. It's a history written over thousands of years. Wishing you a healthy, peaceful, and pain-free life.